Hello students. Today we are going to learn part 2 of chapter 4, that is macroeconomics, determination of income and employment. In the first session we had learnt about the basic concepts of this chapter. Now when we talk about the components of aggregate demand, now since we know that what is aggregate demand, let's study the components of aggregate demand in detail. Demand for goods and services for private consumption, also called as private final consumption expenditure, demand for private investment, demand for goods and services by government, and net export, that is X minus M, which I had already mentioned in the previous session. So if we observe this diagram, AD is our aggregate demand curve, which is nothing but our C plus I, that is consumption plus investment. And when we talk about AS curve, that is aggregate supply curve, which is starting from the origin, that is at the 45-degree angle. Now, if we observe AD curve and AS curve, we have a midpoint which is called as an equilibrium point where AD is equal to AS, which means our aggregate demand is equal to our aggregate supply at OY level of output, which is the equilibrium level of income. So from this we can observe that in AD curve, which is C plus I, it shows a desired level of expenditure by consumer and firms corresponding to each level of income. So the economy is in equilibrium at point E, which I have already mentioned, where C plus I curve intersects the 45-degree line origin. E is the equilibrium point because at this point the level of desired spending on consumption and investment exactly equals the level of total output, and our OY is the level of output which we can observe in the diagram curve. So the equilibrium level of income, let's say if it is 400 crores, wherein our AD is equal to AS is equal to 400 crores, for example. So it is a situation of effective demand. Now what happens when AD is more than AS, which means when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply. So when planned spending, that is AD, is more than the planned output, then our C plus I curve will lie above 45-degree line. It means that consumer and firm together would be buying more goods than firms are willing to produce. So as a result, the planned inventory would fall below the desired level. And when aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, which means when AD is less than AS, then C plus I curve lies below the 45 angle degree line. It means that consumer and firms together would be buying less good than the firms are willing to produce as a result. So the planned inventory would rise. So equilibrium level of income is determined at the level where our planned saving is equal to investment, which means S is equal to I. We can also say this as a saving investment approach, wherein our I is parallel to x-axis in this curve. So our investment is fixed at every level of employment, which is a straight horizontal line parallel to x-axis. So in this curve, we observe that investment curve is parallel to x-axis because the autonomous character of investment, and the saving slope upwards, showing that as income rises, saving also rises. So we can see in this diagram that saving curve is upward sloping. The simple reason, as income increases, saving also increases. And we had point E where X ante saving is equal to X ante investment. So we can see the point E where saving S is equal to I. So we can say that at OY is the equilibrium level of output, which is corresponding to point E. Now, what happens when saving is more than investment? If planned saving is more than planned investment, after a point E, it means that households are not consuming as much as the firm expected them to. And as a result, the inventory rises above the desired level. So in a situation where your saving is more or your planned saving is more than your planned investment, then there might be increase or rise in the inventory. And when the saving is less than investment, so planned investment before point E, that would mean that households are consuming more and saving less. So as a result, planned inventory would fall below the desired level. So this is how the situation would be when saving is more than investment and when saving is less than investment. Then what is full employment equilibrium? It refers to the situation when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply at full employment level. We can see that in this curve or diagram where we can achieve full employment when both are equal. Then what is underemployment equilibrium? It refers to the situation when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply at a level where the resources are not fully employed. And over full employment equilibrium will refer to the situation when AD is equal to AS beyond the full level or full employment level. Now, let's talk about multiplier. It refers to the ratio of change in income to a change in investment. We know very well that there would be change or ratio of change in income to a change in investment, which we can say that K is equal to Y upon I. So the minimum value of multiplier can be 1 and maximum value can be infinity. So multiplier is directly related with MPC, that is marginal propensity to consume, which means that our multiplier K is equal to 1 upon 1 minus MPC. And multiplier is inversely related with MPS, that is marginal propensity to save, wherein our multiplier K is equal to 1 upon MPS. So we have two formula over here to calculate. K is equal to 1 upon 1 minus MPC, that is multiplier is directly related with MPC, and MPS wherein K is equal to 1 upon MPS. So how is the working of multiplier? It is based on the first person's expenditure is another person's income, which means if I'm spending 5 rupees, there is someone who's earning rupees 5 because I'm ready to spend that 5 rupees. So one person's expenditure is another person's income. So multiplier expresses the relationship between an initial increment in investment and resulting increase in aggregate income. And excess demand refers to the situation where aggregate demand is more than supply, corresponding to full employment level of output in the economy. And when we talk about inflationary gap, it shows the gap by which the actual aggregate demand exceeds the required to establish full employment equilibrium. Now, what are the reasons for this excess demand? When we say that aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply, what are the reasons for excess demand? First reason for excess demand is rise in propensity to consume, reduction in taxes, and that is the reason why the people's personal disposable income increases, due to which demand also increases. So reduction in tax, increase in government expenditure, that is government spends more for the welfare and for the public, increase in investment, fall in import, rise in export, and deficit financing. So these are the reasons for excess demand. And the impact of these excess demand is that it leads to inflation without any increase in output, which means that prices of the commodity keeps on increasing, and employment, when we talk about, then leads to inflation without any increase in output and employment, as the economy is already operating at the full employment level. Now let's talk about deficit demand. We know what is excess demand. So what is deficit demand? It refers to the situation wherein our aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, corresponding to the full employment level of output. And yes, it has deflationary gap, which shows the gap by which actual aggregate demand falls short of the aggregate demand required to establish full employment. And the reasons for deficit demand is decrease in propensity to consume, that is the decrease in ability to consume. Taxes have increased, and that's the reason now people don't demand more. Government has decreased its expenditure, fall in investment, rise in import, and fall in export. So these are the reasons for deficit demand. What could be the impact of deficit demand? Deficit demand leads to fall in prices, which in turn leads to fall in the output and employment level. And if you want to correct excess demand, then there are certain measures to correct excess demand. Firstly, decrease in government spending. This is one of the fiscal measures which is undertaken by the government, and it needs to reduce its expenditure in order to decrease the level of aggregate demand. Second measure is to decrease in availability of credit. So central bank aims to reduce the availability of credit through monetary policy, which are quantitative and qualitative instruments. So when we say quantitative instruments, we are talking about bank rate, open market operations, SLR, that is statutory liquidity ratio. And when we talk about qualitative instruments, it's related to increase in margin requirement, moral suasion, credit control, and direct action. So what are the measures to correct deficit demand? Increase in government spending. This is again a fiscal measure which is undertaken by the government, and it needs to increase its expenditure in order to raise the level of demand. And increase in availability of credit. That is, central bank aims to reduce the availability of credit by quantitative instruments. Decrease in bank rate, purchase of securities, decrease in SLR, that is statutory liquidity ratio or legal reserve requirements, and decrease in margin requirement, advice to encourage lending by central bank to commercial bank. That is, central bank advises the commercial bank to encourage the lending, and selective credit controls. So these are the measures through which inflation, deflation, or excess demand or deficit demand could be controlled through fiscal and monetary policy. Thank you.